Hey and welcome gurus to this demo lesson, Implement Azure Front Door. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this demo lesson that we're going to get a bit hands-on and have some fun implementing Azure Front Door. We're going to start off with a case study scenario to help us better understand what we're going to see inside of the Azure Cloud Sandbox when we do our demo setup. And then we're going to walk through the demo steps that we will take to complete our implementation of Azure Front Door. And we'll bring it back to the slides for some key takeaways. So without further ado, our Control-Alt-Suites organization that we're familiar with is going to have a hub virtual network with an application gateway deployed inside of it that is going to be balancing traffic between some resources in its backend pool. And then we're going to have the same setup, but inside of a spoke virtual network that is going to be in a completely separate region. For example, the hub virtual network might be in East US, and then the spoke might be in West US. And this is what we'll see whenever we set up our demo. Again, as always, the setup for the demonstration is available in the resources of this lesson. Now, for the steps that we're going to go through is we're going to make sure that we use Azure Front Door to be able to balance traffic to these application gateways in two different regions in two different virtual networks. And we can do this in a couple of ways. We can implement Azure Front Door Classic. We're actually going to briefly take a look at the Classic SKU. We're not going to actually implement it. We're just going to take a look at the experience of implementing that resource. And then we're actually going to implement Front Door using either the standard or premium SKU, whichever you'd like to take a look at. I will use the standard SKU in mine, but we're going to configure the front end, configure the back end, and configure the routing. And then we're going to review the configuration, take a look at some of the additional features that we can do, and then discuss thoughts on how we might make that solution production ready. Now at this point, let's not waste any more time and make our way to the Azure portal and get started. All right, gurus, so here we are in the Azure Cloud Sandbox. And to get started setting up our demo, we've got our Cloud Shell open. We're going to grab that resources link for the demo setup. We're going to copy it. We're going to bring it down into our Cloud Shell, paste it in, and it's going to prompt us to put in a username and then a password here. So put in your password and then hit enter. We're not going to put a SAS token. And now it's going to go off, run, and deploy our resources to set up this demo. So we'll be back in about 10 to 15 minutes when this is done. All right, gurus, so we're back. And as we can tell, the deployment of our resources has succeeded. So we'll minimize the Cloud Shell here and we'll minimize the essentials portion. And then we'll sort by type. And here we're going to see we have two application gateways, one in the hub virtual network and one in the spoke virtual network, and they're both in two different regions. Now at this point, we're going to come up to the search bar here. We'll type in front door and we'll click on front door and CDN profiles under services, and we'll click create. And this is going to bring us into choosing our offering for Azure Front Door. We're going to come back to the Azure Front Door using the custom create in just a moment for the V2 SKUs, but here we're just going to explore other offerings real fast to see this is how we can create an Azure Front Door Classic. We'll click continue here, and then we're going to show the configuration details for this. We're not actually going to deploy this Classic Front Door because we're going to deploy a standard V2 Front Door, but we're going to walk through the configuration details very quickly just to show how it's a little bit different from the new V2 SKUs. So we'll select our resource group here. It's going to use the resource group location for this Front Door instance. We'll click next into configuration. And here we have our front ends, our domains that we're going to use, the backend pools that we'll configure, and then the routing rules that will tie them together. So we'll click the plus symbol on front end domains, and we're going to give this a unique name globally, and it's going to be ACG Cloud Chase. And this is a unique global name. That's how I can use it. And so the domain would be acgcloudchase.azurefd.net. Moving on, we have our session affinity. We can enable session affinity using front door generated cookies here if we wanted to. We choose to enable those. We'll leave it disabled. And then additionally, we can enable web application firewall, and it would use a WAF policy to do this. We don't have any existing policies in this subscription, and we're going to cover WAF more in a later section. So we'll leave this as disabled and we'll click add here, and we see it's added that front end for us, that domain that will be used to map to the backend pool using that routing rule. Now we'll create that backend pool here, and we'll call this our test BE pool, and we're going to add a backend into it. So we'll click add a backend, and we can choose a backend host type of multiple options here: app service, cloud service, storage, storage classic, application gateway, API management, public IP, traffic manager, or a custom host if we want to use something on-premise. But we're going to use application gateway here. And we see it's already pre-filled some of our options here for subscription, the backend host name. We see this is a drop down pulling in our application gateways. We have the hub and the spoke here. We'll just leave the hub. And then we have the public IP address under the backend host header here. Then we have our HTTP port and our HTTPS port. We're going to leave those as they are, and then we could set the priority and the weight so that we can determine how it's going to distribute traffic to those backends in the backend pool. We'll leave it as it is by default. We'll click add here, and we could choose to add another backend. We could add that spoke into the backend if we wanted to, but we're not going to be actually doing that and creating this front door. So we're just going to move along. Next, we have our health probe here. We could choose to enable the health probe, and we can set the path for the health probe to check, the protocol it checks with, HTTP or HTTPS, the probe method, either head or get request, and the interval, 30 seconds, on how frequently it requests. And then we can check the actual balancing solution or whether or not it's healthy by taking a look at the sample size and seeing if it has what we have deemed as a successful sample size. But we're not going to configure any of that here, so we'll leave that backend probe as disabled. And for the sample size here, we'll just say 2 and 2, and we'll click add. And now we see we have that backend pull. Then we have the routing rule here. And for the routing rule, we'll call this the default routing, and we can specify the accepted protocols, be that HTTP only, HTTPS only, or HTTP and HTTPS. And then we can specify what front end, what domain we want to map to a backend pool, the patterns we want to match, so those URL paths. And here we have a wildcard for matching any. Then we have the route details where we can choose whether or not we want to forward this to a backend pool, like our test BE pool, or redirect it using a redirect type of a 302, 301, 307, or 308. And then we have the redirect protocol. We can use HTTPS, HTTP, or we can match the request. And then we can do some rewriting of that URL, right, to go ahead and replace the host, replace the path, and replace the query string. But we're not going to do any of that. We're going to forward it to a backend pool, and we're not going to do any of the URL rewrite or caching. But if we wanted to, again, we could do a custom forwarding path and enable caching to be able to cache every unique URL, or ignore query strings, ignore specified query strings, or include specified query strings. And then we could set the default cache duration by using that default that comes with Azure Front Door. We're going to leave that as disabled, and we're going to disable the URL rewrite. We'll click add, and now we have that routing rule, and we could click review and create, and it would go off and validate, and then we could create this front door. We're not going to do that, so we'll come back to compare offerings here. We're going to use our Azure Front Door, and we're going to use our custom create here. And then we're going to click continue to create a front door. And what we're going to see is a lot of the same things here. We'll select our resource group. It's going to use that resource group location for our front door profile here. We'll give our front door profile a name. We'll call it our ACG demo FD. And then here's where we can choose that tier. This is our V2 tiers here, the standard or the premium, whether or not we want content optimized or security optimized. We're going to run with standard. We'll click next into secrets. And this is where we have that key vault integration if we want to add certificates here to be used for that end-to-end encryption or TLS termination. We'll click next in endpoints because we don't have any here. And then we're going to click add an endpoint. And here for our endpoints, it's the same thing as we had before with the domains. This is just a front-end endpoint or a front-end domain. We're going to specify a ACG cloud chase because we know it's unique in this case. Make sure to use a unique one for you. You'll see it's inserted that string to make sure that it is unique for my host name. And we can choose whether or not we want to enable this endpoint. We'll click add here. And now it's created that endpoint. And we have a very similar interface here where now we can create that route. We'll choose to add a route here. And we're going to call this the default route. And we see it has that endpoint there. It has the domains that we can select under that endpoint. We had a custom domain there, which we'll cover more in a later demo. And then we have the patterns for URL paths to match. We have a wildcard here, in our case, the slash asterisk. And we could specify other paths such as slash images or slash videos. Then we have the accepted protocols here, and that's HTTP, HTTPS, or HTTP and HTTPS. We'll leave it set as that. And then we have the option to redirect all traffic to use HTTPS. We'll leave the default selected here so that we can introduce an intentional error that we'll fix later. Then we have our origin group here, and we can choose to add a new origin group since we don't have one. And this is the same thing as a back and pull essentially here. We'll call this our demo origin group, and then we'll add origins. These are the same things as backends essentially. And we'll give them a name. We'll call this our app gateway hub, and we'll specify the origin type. Again, we have all the same options here, except we also have a couple others such as Traffic Manager, Azure Spring Cloud, container instances. We're going to use our application gateway. We'll select our hub gateway here, and we're going to see it has the ability to use those HTTP or HTTPS ports 80 and 443. We have the priority and we have the weight, and we can choose whether or not we want to enable this origin. So we'll click add here, and now we can add another origin. We're going to call this one our app gateway spoke, and we're going to select it from the drop down there, and we're going to select all those same settings, click add, and now we can configure that health probe here. We see we have, it's going to check that default directory for the health. It's going to check HTTP or HTTPS, and then we're going to choose the probe method, a GET or a HEAD request, the interval, and then we have the sample size here. In our sample size, we have 2 application gateways, and we'll say that it takes 2 to be healthy. And then for the latency here, if we wanted to specify 0, it's going to do the load balancing to send it to the fastest available backend. Anything else is just going to round robin to the fastest and then next fastest backends. We'll use 0 so we get to the fastest backend when we're doing the load balancing with our front door, and we'll click add here. And now we see that we have that origin group. Then we can specify our origin path if we had a specific path that we wanted to use for this origin group. We don't in our case, so we'll leave it blank. And then the forwarding protocol. And this is where we can choose to match incoming requests. We could use HTTPS only if we wanted to make sure to use one of those secrets that we have that we integrated certificate-wise so that we provide that end-to-end encryption, much like how the accepted protocol would provide us that TLS termination on the front end. We'll match the incoming request here, and now we can choose to enable caching. And here we can specify if we want to ignore the query string, use a query string, ignore specified query strings, or include specified query strings. And then we can choose to disable this if we don't want to use it. But if it was enabled, we can also choose to enable compression so that we're optimizing our caching for Azure Front Door to provide faster performance for our end users. We're going to disable this here. And then next we'll see rules is something that after we create the front door profile, we'll be able to create custom rules and apply them to the routes. So we'll click add here, and we see now we have that default rule that's associated with our front end domain and that origin group, and its status is enabled. So what we're going to do now is we're going to click review and create at this point. It's going to validate that deployment, and we'll click create. And due to the time of this lesson, we're going to split this into 2 parts, and we'll be back in about 15 to 20 minutes in part 2 of this lesson to see that this resource has successfully provisioned. So I'll see you in part 2 of this lesson, gurus.